All right. Hi, everyone. This is lesson 6, where we're going to, we had just finished evaluating the impact of Brown v. Board. So lesson 6 is going to explore the kind of school segregation in recent years. And we're going to look at a series of visualized data. I encourage you to listen to lesson 5 first if you missed the class session, the virtual class session, so that you have the background context for Brown v. Board and the impact in the kind of relative short term, because we're going to be looking in this video at school segregation and desegregation within recent years. So it's important to look at this particular strategy that some counties or some neighborhoods have been using, some communities have been using, which is the possibility of seceding from their school district to create their own school district. And there's a variety of ways that they can do that. Some involve seceding to create their own school district. Some involve kind of incorporating into their own town so that they can establish their own school district there. And so, since 2000, EdBuild has reported 128 communities trying to secede from their school district. They note that not all of them were for racial reasons, right? So if you look at the cluster in Maine, some of that dealt with issues dealing with enrollment and whatnot. Maine is a predominantly white state, and in some of these cases, it was happening within neighborhoods that were all, pretty much all white. Nevertheless, there have been a lot of efforts that were much more racially intended and targeted. For example, Jefferson County here is an example of where there were 8 total successions, the last of which was defeated by a federal court that because Jefferson County was under a desegregation federal order, they defeated one of the successions because they were able to find very clear racialized intent, in part because of Facebook posts that are from the group that was pushing for a succession that basically argued that succession would allow them to have more control over their student demographics. And so in many cases, these are neighborhoods where they are more white, more affluent sections of a school district that has other sections of the school district that, other neighborhoods that feed into the school district that are more, students of color and also more economically diverse. And so efforts to try and remove themselves from those districts. In many ways, this is kind of like a new legal strategy for segregating schools. In the 1950s and 60s, the strategy was white flight and suburbanization. So if you look at this chart here, you'll notice that from 1950 to 1990, the share of white families living in the suburbs increased dramatically compared to living in the city. And so suburbanization, which was largely supported by the government, by the federal government, when in the 1930s they established the Federal Housing Administration, which backed or insured mortgages for white families, but not for Black families and other families of color. And so there, and if I remember correctly, from 1930 through to around somewhere in the mid 1960s, about $2 billion in mortgages were insured by the Federal Housing Administration going to white families. Black and other families of color were excluded from that opportunity. And so to get a mortgage that's not insured is unsteady, and Black families were left with very difficult means of, and it opened up a whole space for exploiting Black families. And we'll talk about that later in terms of the ways in which predatory loan companies and whatnot, and individuals would sell Black families housing on contract, which would not be the same thing as a mortgage and was much more predatory. Anyhow, this suburbanization, white suburbanization of white flight ensured a segregated school system after Brown v. Board. All right, so I want to look at how a set of data that shows that Black and Latinx students are increasingly isolated in high poverty school districts. So you might notice with this chart over the last 15, 20 years, there's a greater share of students in high poverty schools where the population is over 75% Black or Hispanic, and so there's increasing isolation in schools with a high percentage of students of color and high percentage of poverty. You might notice, right, that with this chart, that the percentage of Black students in schools that are 90 to 100% minority dropped significantly in almost all parts of the country, with the exception of the Northeast, where it has been slowly increasing since Brown v. Board. So this chart goes back to 1968, which was 14 years after Brown v. Board, and that was during the era of intentional efforts to desegregate. Strategies such as the ones used in like Boston and Detroit, where students were essentially bussed between different school districts. And so, but that kind of began to end after 1974, after a case that originated in Detroit called Milliken v. Bradley, where the Supreme Court said that the federal government cannot enforce basically surrounding districts to participate in desegregation programs with the city. And the reason why Detroit had to do that was because the Detroit schools were so overwhelmingly Black that it would be very difficult to desegregate within Detroit public schools. So they had to bring in and out students, mostly out, mostly busing Black students to the suburbs. But they had to include the surrounding school districts in the suburbs because of the white flight patterns that we noticed here. So it is interesting to note that the Northeast has, throughout this entire period, been getting more segregated, and all of the the South and the West has been getting more segregated since basically the 1980s. All right, so let's move on. This chart would show that segregation between communities is increasing. So when comparing a town to another town versus segregation within communities, which is decreasing, if you notice it on this side of the chart within the last 1990s and 2000s, but it is still quite high. The segregation rate was already so high, so the decreasing is minuscule, but is moving in that direction. And so you'll notice that, segregation between places is increasing on many fronts, whereas it's decreasing within. However, if you notice right here, research coming out of University of Berkeley shows that the demographics of school attendance zones, where the percent of Black or Latinx students is high, which is these darker purple colors, and so you'll notice that there are some zones, right, within cities that are more diverse, but there are zones that are more heavily isolated, where you would have pretty much majority or all white schools, so white students isolated in all white schools, and Black students isolated, Black and Latinx students isolated in all Black and Latinx schools, with some mixing. So you'll notice, Houston and Atlanta and DC and East Baton Rouge are some of the most segregated ones of this particular set of cities. And finally, it's important to note, and this goes back to the issue with Brown v. Board, the issue is, I'm going to make an argument here that the issue is not, and this is an argument I've gleaned from lots of sources, right? It's not that, when students of color, in particular Black students, attend majority white schools that something magical happens. You might remember from Nicole Hannah-Jones's piece that we listened to at the beginning of the school year on the Normandy School District. It's not that something magical happens because of proximity to whiteness. No. In many cases, Black students and students of color face, more increasing social issues and barriers in terms of harassment and things like that at majority white schools. But they have access to more resources because in our society, whiter schools tend to be more affluent and have more resources. And there was a study and so therefore the issue is in the distribution of resources, where whiter and more affluent schools tend to have more resources than schools with more students of color that are poorer. And in part, that's because, Black and Latinx students have higher, in terms of youth, have higher rates of poverty than white youth. White students tend to attend, and I want to get this statistic right, so I'm going to pull out here and pull up my notes. So white students tend to attend schools. So a typical white student goes to a school where fewer than 50% of students are low income, whereas Black and Latino students tend to be in schools where there are higher rates of students who are low income. And so why does that matter in terms of resources? Well, it's because we have a school district system, school funding system, where schools are funded by the states, a tiny bit by the federal government, and a lot by the local tax base. So let's take Philadelphia and Lower Merion as an example. Here's Philadelphia School District, here's Lower Merion School District. Philadelphia School District students are funded somewhere in the last 10 years, it's varied between like $13,000 and $16,000 per student. Lower Merion, $30,000 per student. Why is Lower Merion double the per pupil funding rate than Philadelphia? Well, it's because Lower Merion has a wealthy tax base. It's 75% white. 96% are not low income. So, it's a very small percentage of people who are low income. And therefore the tax base is wealthy, and a lot of Pennsylvania schools, the majority of funding for each school district comes from the local tax base. Philadelphia doesn't have as wealthy of a tax base, and so our schools, are not as well funded as Lower Merion. And so this happens all across, if you read this report, this happens all across the country. They studied 1,000 districts, borders. So basically borders where on one side, just like this, you have a district that is, largely students of color, low income. In Philadelphia is, about 85%, 86% students of color. Lower Merion is 25% students of color. So, that situation and the situation where there's an economic gap. And that results in, on average, the wealthier and whiter side receiving over $4,000 more per student each year. And so that's the piece that's really relevant here. That's why desegregation matters, is because it's about access to resources. One might argue that if one could make those resources widely available on an equitable basis, it wouldn't necessarily matter whether schools are largely diverse or not. The resources issue is what matters. Now, you can see arguments on both sides of that, but it is important to note that what makes desegregation important is the access to resources. And so what can be done? Well, inclusionary zoning can be done. Building affordable housing in well-resourced school districts is one approach to ensure that that there's more economic diversity in those well-resourced school districts. School boards can draw school boundary lines here, like you're seeing here, that lessen segregation within the school district. States can revise their funding systems so that the locally raised revenues is not the large portion. They can make sure that the funding disparities are eliminated